you very much for speaking
Thank
to us.
you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So the highest profile movie release of the week is certainly The Hunger Games. You just heard from Jennifer Lawrence. Now Mark in Boston saw it a few hours ago.
It's an interesting thing that you were talking there about her singing. There's a scene in the Jennifer Lawrence movie Winter's Bone in which she walks into a hut and people are playing Fair and Tender Ladies, which is a sort of lovely old English come American ballad, which is actually one of the scariest renditions of that song I've ever heard. In terms of the Hunger Games, the first thing you have to do is you have to locate it. I mean, obviously, because of where it's come, people have connected it up with Twilight because, you know, it's based on a massively best-selling novel which has a laudatory quote from Stephanie Meyer on the front of the book. It has a strong teenage female heroine. There is at least the beginnings of an apparent love triangle going on there. And so consequently, there has been an awful lot of emphasis on the people who are going to go and see this are the same people who made Twilight the huge hit that it was. Although, interestingly enough, in the screening that I saw midnight in Boston, I asked two people whether they were Twilight fans, and they said no. And they showed the screening, the trailer for Breaking Dawn Part 2 before the movie, and it raised a few titters and a few giggles, which seemed to suggest that there's not an entire crossover there. As the story has been explained in that interview you just did, I mean, obviously the things behind it are, when you watch that story, you remember, you know, Nigel Neal's TV play Year of the Sex Olympics, you think of The Most Deadly Game, you think of the short story Rollerball Murder by William Harrison, which then, of course, became Rollerball, which has at its heart that idea of a gladiatorial game which is made to pacify and keep down the people, which is threatened by the idea that somebody taking part in it, Jonathan E., in the case of the James Caan character, becomes bigger than the game. It's that famous line, "It's not a game, it was never meant to be a game." You also think of Running Man, and of course it's interesting because Stephen King is also quoted alongside Stephanie Meyer as a fan of Hunger Games. And then things like Series 7, The Contenders, which was dealing with the growth of reality television. Although I have to say I wasn't a fan of that film. I always thought it was like a pale imitation of Man Bites Dog. Then you have behind that also Battle Royale, which there's no getting away from it. There is a similarity between this and Battle Royale. I mean, you brought it up in the interview yourself. A couple of people have said, I really want to hear a review of this movie without anyone mentioning it, but you can't not mention it because that central idea about kids being set against each other in some, you know, organised game that is there. You can't get away from it. Also, in the deep distance, there are the spectre of movies like We Need to Talk About Kevin and Bowling for Columbine because of the adolescent violence. Of course, the BBFC themselves, in their report for giving it a 12 certificate, say the film is based upon a well-known novel that is widely read by people in this age group. The story has some similarities to, and this is obviously the uber text behind this, The Lord of the Flies, which, they point out, also features violence between young people and is taught in schools. And so all of that is going on in the back. Now, I sat there watching the film, and I have to say the first thing I thought about it was, in England, they've trimmed the film to get a 12. I suspect that the version that I saw in America wasn't trimmed, although I think that the trims are fairly minor. It's the intensity of it and the central theme of it that remains disturbing no matter whether or not you trim away at the violence. And one of the first things to say is that I thought it was a very intense experience watching it, because that central theme, which we've seen so many times before and it's been worked through in different ways as allegory and parable, it doesn't take away from the fact that it is a shocking theme. And there is one moment in the film as the games begin when the thing really kicks off, which I was genuinely taken aback by, and it wasn't to do with the level of explicit violence. It was to do with suddenly the awfulness of it all being brought home in a very visceral way. And it's funnily enough, on television here in America, they've got psychologists talking about, is this film too intense for your teenagers? And the intensity is definitely the key word, because it is intense, it is dark, it is, even to a hardened horror film fan like me, it doesn't matter whether it's Battle Royale or this or Lord of the Flies. The theme itself is dealt with in a serious enough way that it is intense and it is disturbing, and it ought to be, but it is. I was slightly taken aback by how full on it was. You've obviously also got in the background the Joan of Arc story, which was referred to there in that interview as well. There are certain things about it which don't entirely work for me. I'm not quite sure about the balance between the Hunger Games themselves and then the surrounding meta-narrative in which the future appears to have been designed by Tim Burton and Vivienne Westwood with a hint of Volker Schlondorf and Handmaid's Tale. And occasionally what I wanted was more bite on the subject of reality TV and the rise of reality TV and the pernicious quality of that kind of combative, public spectacle, which is now, I mean, actually, since some of those movies that I cited before, has become, very much a reality. So it's not without flaws. It's not completely perfect. But the fact of the matter, and of course, as you'll know, both the director and the writer have both said that, Battle Royale wasn't something that they were aware of other than as a name. They said, well, actually, you could say this is Romeo and Juliet, and there are very, very heavy nods to Shakespeare, to Shakespeare's text all the way through that. But the fact of the matter is, it's gripping, it's involving. Jennifer Lawrence is terrific in the central role. It is directed up to the very, very edge of what would be acceptable for that age limit, which of course they have to get because that is the core audience for the, for the books. And it is a story which has something to say about exploitation, about revolution, about the way in which entertainment is used to, that old thing about, television being the neo-opiate of the masses, and the way in which those kind of specters, that's an idea, as I said, you can trace it back to William Harrison's Rollerball Murder and indeed the Norman Jewison film Rollerball, not so much the remake of Rollerball, which completely dropped the ball. But the very fact that you can even talk about those things as touchstones in relation to a movie which is, as I said, following on from the Twilight demographic to a 12 certificate audience, I think is pretty remarkable. So although it is not without flaws, and although I think that there are elements of the reality TV thing that could have cut harder, that could have been more incisive for me, the central dread and the central sense of, blimey, Charlie, that is dark, that is playing out in the games itself, I thought was very well handled, and I was genuinely quite surprised. I haven't read the book. You have, Simon.
Yeah. I read the book.
Did you feel the same way as I did?
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't that impressed with the CGI, and I thought there was a lot of hunger before you got to the games. But you mentioned the sense of dread, which is there throughout the book, and occasionally you put it down and you have to remind yourself what it is you're talking about. They handle absolutely fantastically. I think Jennifer Lawrence is really, she is epic, and she handles it exactly right. She is slightly too, in the book I think she's 16, and there's no way she's even trying to be 16. I think in it, but I thought it was terrific all the way through, and we did think for a while Toby Jones wasn't actually going to say anything.
Yes,
because
Toby is in the sort of wraparound Vivian Westwood, Volker Schlondorf, Tim Burton section, and there are several cutaways to Toby Jones raising an eyebrow, looking a little askew. Do you think, is he going to say something? And then finally he does say they're genetically engineered wasps.
But the bit that you mentioned when the games actually do start, and I would say about a minute before that, where Jennifer Lawrence sort of gets into a tube to be inserted into the games, where she is genuine, she looks terrified, and we're terrified, and then the games start and everybody's terrified, which was terrific. I'll just do.
Didn't that sequence leave you genuine? I don't use this word, but didn't that sequence leave you genuinely stunned?
Yes, and I was just wondering how they were going to do it, given the grim nature of what they are portraying. And there are a couple of sequences. There's one sort of death in particular where you're shocked all over again and reminded exactly what the basic point of the Hunger Games are.
Yeah.
So a few emails, and I imagine we'll have most of this conversation next week when everyone else has managed to see it. But a few opening comments. Stephen Jones, first of all, just got back from a screening of the Hunger Games. What a pleasant surprise. Despite the audience of university students who acted like 7-year-olds and broke the code of conduct on countless occasions, I had a very enjoyable experience. I'm all for a blockbuster if it's as character and story driven as this. The chilling, repressive tone of the film really made it stand out, especially in the scenes in the city where the extravagantly dressed citizens left an unpleasant taste in the mouth. Great performances from Jennifer Lawrence, Stanley Tucci and Elizabeth Banks. Stanley Tucci, a rather extraordinary TV host. Scott, Hunger Games is fantastic. As a fan of the book, it is a must-see and is among some of the very best book-to-film translations that I've seen. Highly recommended. I'm going for a second viewing tomorrow. Jack Horatio Gregson, The Hunger Games is great. I went with no expectations, having not read the books and knowing very little about the plot. As soon as the film started, I was engrossed. The young cast are great. The emotion and threat levels all feel very high. And whilst the action is nothing to marvel at, the story and the characters are so great that you really don't mind. Hope this franchise comes to be, as this film was incredibly enjoyable. Who gets to see this? I suppose it's a little unfair because you might not have seen the UK version with the cuts. My 12-year-old son went to see it. He thought it was fantastic. I thought it was wonderful. Who would you recommend it for?
Well, I mean, I went with my daughter, who's 13, and who's a huge Twilight fan, and who had literally finished reading the book an hour before the screening started, and she gave it the full thumbs up. And so I said the person I was speaking to in the seat behind us looked like she was 17, 18. Interestingly enough, I said, "You a science fiction fan?" She said, "Yeah, I love science fiction. I absolutely love science fiction." I did say to her, "John Carter?" She went, "Of Mars, no." And so it is. There's a science fiction audience out there as well. But I think it will play to boys, to teenage boys and teenage girls, and demonstrably to knackered old adults like myself, who will still be taken aback by just how strong certain sections of it are.
And I think there was we just mentioned it briefly in the interview, but it is a film with a moral compass. There is bad violence and good violence.
Yes, and the BBFC are very clear about this. Again, I would advise anybody to go to the BBFC website or download their app, or even PBBFC, which gives you even more. They have clearly thought about the issues very long and hard.
And we'll pick up some of these points on the programme next week. Don't forget, the podcast will be available